Emily approached the man before Rick could intervene. She could feel her manager's sharp gaze burning into her back, but she ignored it. "Good morning," she said, offering a warm smile. "Can I get you a table?" The man looked startled, as if he hadn't expected kindness. He hesitated, shifting his grip on the duffel bag, before nodding slowly. Yeah, that'd be nice," he murmured. His voice was rough, hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken much in days. Emily led him to a booth by the window, one of the few empty spots in the diner. The man sat down carefully, placing the duffel bag beside him as if afraid it would be taken away. She handed him a menu, though she doubted he could afford much. Still, she refused to assume. "Can I get you some coffee to start?" she asked. He looked up at her, something like gratitude flickering in his tired blue eyes. "That would be great," he said. Emily nodded and turned toward the coffee station, but before she could take a step, Rick's voice cut through the air. "Emily." She froze, knowing exactly what was coming. Turning slowly, she met Rick's disapproving glare. He stood behind the counter, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice low but firm. "Serving a customer," she said simply. Rick scoffed, shaking his head. "You know he can't pay." Emily glanced back at the man, who had lowered his gaze, as if ashamed to be the subject of the conversation. Her heart squeezed. "I don't know that," she replied. "And even if he can't, what's the harm in letting him sit for a while?" Rick sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're not a shelter, Emily. Paying customers don't want to be bothered by." He gestured vaguely toward the man. "People like that." Emily felt a spark of anger rise in her chest. "People like that?" she repeated. Rick sighed again, this time more frustrated. "Just make it quick," he muttered before turning away. Emily took a steadying breath and went to pour the coffee. When she returned to the table, the man was still looking down, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the menu. "Here you go," she said, setting the cup down gently. "Thank you," he murmured, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic mug. He took a slow sip, exhaling as if savoring the simple comfort. After a beat of silence, Emily spoke. "What's your name?" The man hesitated before answering. "James," he said quietly. "Well, James, it's nice to meet you." "I'm Emily." He looked up at her then, studying her face as if trying to understand why she was being kind to him. Eventually, he gave a small nod. "Nice to meet you too," he said. Emily smiled. "Take your time looking over the menu. If you need anything, just let me know." James nodded, but as she walked away, she noticed he didn't even glance at the menu. Instead, he reached for his duffel bag, pulling it a little closer. She had the strange feeling that whatever was inside that bag held a story she wasn't ready for. Emily kept an eye on James as she moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and taking orders. Every so often, she glanced toward his booth, noticing how he kept his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, as if absorbing its warmth. He barely touched the menu. Instead, he occasionally glanced around the diner, observing the people, the conversations, the life around him. She could tell he was hesitant, perhaps embarrassed, but there was something else too, a kind of deep exhaustion, as if life had worn him down to the bone. After a while, she returned to his table. "You decided what you'd like?" James hesitated, then slowly shook his head. I don't have money," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily had already expected this. Without a word, she pulled out her notepad and jotted something down. "Well, today's special is a hot meal on the house," she said, tearing off the order slip. "And I won't take no for an answer." James looked up at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily offered a small smile before heading to the kitchen. As she pinned the order slip to the board, Rick shot her a look. "You paying for that?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Take it out of my tips if you have to." Rick huffed but didn't argue further. Minutes later, Emily returned to James' table with a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and crispy bacon. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the meal, and for the first time, Emily saw the slightest hint of a smile. This is too much," James murmured. "Eat," She insisted gently. Enjoy. He hesitated only a moment longer before picking up his fork. The way he ate, slowly at first, then hungrily, told her he hadn't had a real meal in a long time. She didn't hover, wanting him to eat in peace, but as she moved around the diner, she noticed other customers casting side glances at him. Some whispered amongst themselves, clearly disapproving. An older man at the counter muttered just loud enough for Emily to hear, "This ain't a soup kitchen." She clenched her jaw but ignored him. James, however, seemed to notice the looks. He slowed down, his shoulders hunching slightly as if trying to make himself smaller. His hand drifted to his duffel bag again, pulling it closer. Emily's heart squeezed. She wanted to say something, to tell him he had nothing to be ashamed of, but she knew words wouldn't erase years of hardship. Instead, she walked over and casually refilled his coffee cup. "Don't worry about them," she said quietly. "Just enjoy your meal." James looked up at her, and for a brief second, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Something fragile, like a man trying to remember what kindness felt like. "Thank you," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded and walked away, letting him have his moment. For a while, things seemed okay. James ate slowly, savoring every bite, while Emily continued her shift. But then, something unexpected happened. As James reached for his coffee, he accidentally nudged his duffel bag. The zipper was partially open, and something inside shifted. A piece of paper, a crumpled, yellowed envelope, slipped out and landed on the floor. Emily was passing by at that exact moment, and she instinctively bent down to pick it up. "I got it," James said quickly, reaching for it. But it was too late. Emily's eyes caught sight of something on the envelope before she handed it back. It was an official-looking document, old and creased, with a name scrawled across the top in faded ink. And that name made her breath catch in her throat, because it was the name of someone she knew. Someone she never expected to be connected to a homeless man sitting in her diner. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she handed the envelope back to James, her heart pounding in her chest. She had only caught a glimpse of the name, but it was enough to shake her. The name written on the envelope was William Carter. Her mind raced. She had seen that name before, many times. William Carter was not just any name. It belonged to a man who had made headlines years ago, a wealthy businessman who had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind a massive fortune and an empire with no successor. His sudden vanishing act had been the subject of countless theories. Some said he had fled to another country, others believed he had died under suspicious circumstances. And yet, here sat James, a homeless man clutching an envelope with William Carter's name on it. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "James," she said carefully, "where did you get that?" James stiffened, his fingers tightening around the envelope as he shoved it deep into his duffel bag. "It's nothing," he muttered. His entire demeanor changed, his posture tense, his eyes avoiding hers. Emily hesitated. She didn't want to push him, but something in her gut told her that this was important, that James was hiding something, something big. Before she could say anything else, a loud voice interrupted them. "Is there a problem here?" Emily turned to see Rick standing with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his tone laced with irritation. "No," she said quickly. Rick's eyes flicked to James, then to the bag he clutched so desperately. "Look, I've let this go on long enough," he said. "You've had your meal, but we can't have you staying here all day. We run a business, not a charity." James lowered his head, his grip tightening on the bag. Emily felt anger rise in her chest. "Rick, come on," she said, stepping between them. "He's not bothering anyone." Rick exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Emily, I know you mean well, but this isn't your problem." But that was the thing. Somehow, it felt like it was. Before Rick could press further, James abruptly stood up. "It's okay," he mumbled. "I should go." Emily's heart clenched. "James, wait." But he was already moving, slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder and heading for the door. He walked with a slight limp, his body hunched as if the weight of the world rested on his back. She watched him go, feeling helpless. And then, before he could step outside, James suddenly stumbled. His knees buckled, and in an instant, he collapsed to the floor. Gasps filled the diner. A few customers stood up, but no one moved toward him. Emily, however, was already rushing forward. "James!" she cried, kneeling beside him. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. She shook his shoulder gently. "James, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. I'm fine," he rasped. No, he wasn't. Emily turned to Rick. "Call an ambulance." Rick hesitated for a second, then nodded and hurried behind the counter to grab the phone. James weakly tried to sit up, but Emily stopped him. "Stay still," she said firmly. His duffel bag had slipped from his grasp in the fall, and for the first time, it lay open. And that was when Emily saw it. Among the worn clothes and tattered blankets, she spotted several old photographs, pictures of a younger James, standing beside a man she instantly recognized. William Carter. Her breath caught, but that wasn't all. Beneath the photos, tucked carefully between folded papers, was a document. A birth certificate. Emily's eyes widened as she read the name listed under Father, William Carter. She looked down at James in shock. James wasn't just some homeless man. He was William Carter's son. Emily's mind raced as she stared at the birth certificate. The pieces were coming together, but they formed a picture she never could have imagined. James, the quiet, weary man she had just served a meal, was the son of William Carter, the missing millionaire. How had he ended up here, homeless and struggling? Why had no one known about him? And most importantly, did James himself even know? Before she could ask, the sound of sirens pierced the air outside. The ambulance had arrived. The paramedics rushed in, kneeling beside James as they checked his vitals. Emily backed away to give them space, but James's tired eyes found hers. "I don't need a hospital," he murmured weakly, trying to sit up. One of the paramedics, a woman with short dark hair, gave him a firm but understanding look. "Sir, your blood pressure is dangerously low. When was the last time you had a full meal?" James hesitated. Emily already knew the answer. "We're taking you in," the paramedic continued, motioning to her partner. "You need medical attention." James sighed in resignation as they carefully lifted him onto the stretcher. As they wheeled him toward the door, Emily made a split-second decision. She couldn't let him leave without answers. "Wait," she called, hurrying after them. James turned his head slightly, looking at her with tired curiosity. She took a deep breath. "James, did you know your father was William Carter?" The reaction was immediate. His body tensed, his fingers gripping the stretcher's edge. For a moment, he looked like he was going to deny it. Then, he exhaled slowly, the fight draining out of him. "Yes." Emily's heart pounded. "Then why?" James cut her off with a small, humorless chuckle. "Why am I here?" His eyes drifted to the ceiling, as if lost in thought. "Because money doesn't mean a damn thing when the people you love don't care about you." Emily's breath caught. "My father," James continued, his voice quieter now, "never wanted the world to know he had a son. I was an inconvenience. My mother raised me alone, but she never let me feel unwanted. She did everything for me, until she got sick. Cancer." His jaw tightened. "We had nothing. My father could have helped, but he refused. Said it wasn't his responsibility." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. "I lost her," James whispered. "And after that, I lost everything. I tried to build a life, but doors kept shutting in my face. No one wants to help a man who has nothing. And the one person who could have helped," his voice broke slightly, "never did." Emily swallowed hard. She had read about William Carter's wealth, his influence, his massive empire. And yet, he had let his own son suffer? She felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: anger, sadness, disbelief. The paramedics exchanged a glance. "We should get moving." James looked at Emily one last time. "Thank you," he said softly, "for the food, for everything." As they wheeled him out, Emily stood frozen in place. She couldn't let it end like this. She needed to do something. Emily couldn't sleep that night. James's story haunted her. The thought of someone being abandoned by their own father, left to struggle alone, was unbearable. She tossed and turned, replaying everything in her head. His weary eyes, his quiet resignation, the heartbreaking truth in his words. The next morning, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let James disappear into the system again. After her shift, she rushed to the hospital, asking for James at the front desk. The nurse gave her a skeptical look before glancing at the records. "He checked out this morning," she said. Emily's heart sank. "Do you know where he went?" The nurse shook her head. "He refused extended care. Said he didn't want to be a burden." A burden. Emily clenched her fists. That was how James saw himself. A man the world had cast aside. Someone no one cared about. But he was wrong. She didn't know where he was, but she knew one thing. His story deserved to be heard. She spent the next few days searching for any information about William Carter. There had to be people who had known him, people who still cared about his legacy. She dug through old news articles, corporate filings, anything that could give her a lead. And then, she found it. A charity event hosted by one of Carter's former business partners was happening that weekend. A gathering of the city's elite. If there was any place where she could make people listen, it was there. Emily didn't belong in that world, but that didn't matter. She borrowed a dress from a friend, did her best to blend in, and walked into the event with her heart pounding. She spotted a group of executives discussing Carter's legacy, talking about his brilliant mind and his unmatched success. It made her sick. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said. They turned, surprised to see her. "And you are?" one man asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm someone who knows the truth about William Carter," she said firmly. Murmurs spread through the group. "What truth?" Emily hesitated for only a second before speaking. He had a son he abandoned, a son who's out there, homeless, because Carter refused to acknowledge him. Silence. A few people exchanged glances. Some looked doubtful. Others looked uncomfortable. "That's a serious accusation," one man finally said. Emily pulled out her phone and held up a picture, the photograph she had taken of James's birth certificate before she left the hospital. "This is real," she said. "James Carter is out there, and no one has done anything to help him." One of the women in the group, a lawyer, took a closer look, her expression shifting. If this is authentic, then Carter's estate has a legal heir. A ripple of realization spread through the crowd. Emily pressed forward. "James doesn't care about the money. He's lived his whole life without it. But what he deserves is justice. He deserves to be acknowledged." The conversation exploded from there. Within hours, news began to spread. Reporters picked up the story. Lawyers debated the legal implications. And within days, James's name was everywhere. When Emily finally found him again, sitting in the same alley near the diner, he looked at her with cautious confusion. "What did you do?" he asked. She smiled. "I made the world see you." Tears welled in his eyes. For the first time, James wasn't invisible, and he never would be again.